when Japan's 12-to-1 kill ratio hit a wall of steel. In the opening months of World War II, the skies over the vast Pacific Ocean belonged to a single, terrifyingly effective machine, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M-0. It wasn't merely an aircraft. It was a symbol of seeming invincibility, an ethereal ghost of the sky, so advanced and nimble that it racked up a near-mythical 12-to-1 kill ratio against the stunned and outmatched American fighters sent to oppose it. For an Allied pilot in those desperate early days, the sudden appearance of a Zero on his tail was the beginning of a dance with death, a harrowing, high-G ballet that the Allied pilot almost always lost. The sleek white fighter became a specter of dread in the ready rooms of American carriers and airfields, a legend whispered in hushed, fearful tones. This is the story of the profound terror those pilots faced, the incredible stroke of luck and brilliant tactical innovation that finally began to change everything, and the heavily armored wall of steel America, methodically designed and built to finally and decisively break the Zero's reign. December 7th, 1941. The world awakens to the shocking news of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. But as the smoke begins to clear over the shattered fleet in Hawaii, a deeper, more chilling realization sets in among military strategists. The devastation wasn't just a result of tactical surprise, it was a testament to the breathtaking power and sophistication of the weapon that had led the assault. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter had announced its arrival on the world stage, and with it, a brutal new era of air combat had begun. For the harrowing months that followed, the Zero was more phantom than airplane. It was a deadly apparition that haunted the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, contemptuously sweeping aside any Allied aircraft that dared to challenge it. American, British, and Dutch pilots, flying in their sluggish, though rugged, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and the stubby, ill-fated Brewster Buffaloes, could only share harrowing tales of a fighter that seemed to defy the known laws of physics. They spoke of a machine that could outclimb, outrun, and most terrifyingly of all, outturn anything they had. A dogfight with a Zero was a disorienting, one-sided affair. It could snap roll and vanish in the blink of an eye, only to reappear, as if by magic, in a perfect firing position on their 6 o'clock. The stories coming back from the front lines were filled with a palpable sense of dread and helplessness. An American pilot would feel a surge of confidence, believing he had a Zero perfectly lined up in his sights, only for the Japanese fighter to perform an impossibly tight turn, reversing the situation in seconds. Fights that began with an American advantage would violently twist into desperate, spiraling struggles for survival, struggles that more often than not, the Americans lost. The numbers filtering back to command were grim, almost unbelievable. In some of the earliest combat operations of the war, the Zero was achieving a kill ratio cited as high as 12-to-1. 12 Allied planes plummeting from the sky, often in flames, for every single Zero shot down. It was a statistic that shattered Allied confidence and rapidly built an aura of invincibility around the Japanese fighter and its pilots. So what was the secret behind the Zero's staggering dominance? It was a masterpiece of a single-minded, uncompromising design philosophy. The plane's chief engineer, Jiro Horikoshi, was given a demanding set of requirements by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Create a long-range, carrier-based fighter that prioritized maneuverability and firepower above all else. To achieve this, Horikoshi and his team embarked on a ruthless quest for weight reduction. Every single non-essential ounce was stripped from the airframe. There would be no heavy armor plating to protect the pilot from enemy fire. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb a bullet and prevent a catastrophic fire. The very structure of the plane was crafted from a new, top-secret aluminum alloy that was both incredibly light and exceptionally strong. The result was a fighter that weighed thousands of pounds less than its American counterparts. Coupled with a 950 horsepower engine, the Zero possessed a power-to-weight ratio that was simply off the charts. It was a beautiful, elegant, and utterly deadly dancer in the sky. This lethal equation was completed by the men flying the machine. The early aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy were, without exaggeration, among the best trained and most experienced pilots in the entire world. They were the elite survivors of a brutal, multi-year training program that deliberately washed out all but the most gifted and determined candidates. With pre-war pilots logging at least 250 to 400 hours before they even reached an operational squadron, many entered combat with thousands of flight hours under their belts. They were true masters of their machines, viewing air combat not merely as a military mission, but as a personal, almost spiritual duel. Against this potent combination of a superior machine and unparalleled skill, the Americans initially had no effective answer. Their main naval fighter at the time, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was in many ways the philosophical opposite of the Zero. It was heavy, exceptionally rugged, and relatively slow. In a turning fight, a Wildcat pilot was a sitting duck. Early American strategy against the Zero, often passed down from the hard-won experience of the Flying Tigers in China, basically boiled down to one stark piece of advice. If you see a Zero, run away. But in the chaos of war, you can't always run. The fear in the ready rooms was a thick, tangible presence. To be a fighter pilot in the Pacific in early 1942 was to face the grim reality that the odds were impossibly stacked against you. A solution had to be found, and it had to be found fast. But to defeat a ghost, you first have to catch it. Every weapon, no matter how formidable, has a weakness. Every seemingly invincible force possesses an Achilles heel. The Japanese Zero was no different, but its secrets were veiled in advanced engineering and hidden within the chaos of high-G combat maneuvers. To defeat it, the Allies couldn't just fight harder, they were forced to fight smarter. The breakthrough that would begin to level the playing field came in two distinct parts. One was born from grim necessity and tactical genius, the other from an almost unbelievable stroke of luck. The first, crucial piece of the puzzle didn't emerge from an engineering lab or a wind tunnel, but from the brilliant mind of a single naval aviator, Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thack. Born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Thack was a 1927 Naval Academy graduate who had spent a decade as a test pilot and gunnery expert, earning a reputation as a thoughtful and innovative tactician. As commander of Fighting Squadron 3, he listened with growing concern to the terrifying after-action reports from his pilots. He knew with cold certainty that his F-4F Wildcat was toast in a one-on-one turning dogfight with a Zero. So, he reasoned, if one plane couldn't possibly win, maybe two working together could. Night after night, at his kitchen table, Thack puzzled over the problem, using matchsticks to represent fighters in a deadly sky ballet. He meticulously reenacted the combat scenarios his men described, searching for a way to turn the Wildcat's weaknesses, its weight and slower turn rate, into strengths. He developed a revolutionary tactic that required two pairs of fighters, or two elements, flying together. The core idea was to transform a defensive action into an offensive trap. When a Zero latched onto the tail of one Wildcat, the bait, that pilot would execute a turn towards his wingman, not away from the fight. The wingman, the hook, would then turn sharply towards the first plane. As their flight paths crossed, the Zero, glued to its original target and unable to match the rolling speed of the American planes, would fly straight into the waiting gun sights of the second Wildcat. It was a defensive tactic that masterfully turned one pilot's crisis into his partner's opportunity. They called it the beam defense position, but history would forever remember it by its creator's name, the Thak Weave. Thak and his squadron finally put the new tactic to the ultimate test in the fiery crucible of the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Leading a flight of just 6 Wildcats on an escort mission, he was ambushed by a swarm of nearly 20 Zeros. Outnumbered and hopelessly outmaneuvered, his flight should have been wiped from the sky in minutes. Instead, they weaved. As a Zero locked onto the tail of his wingman, Ensign Ram Dib, Thak saw his partner brake hard towards him. Thak dove under Dib, lined up the unsuspecting Japanese fighter that was now perfectly framed in his sights, and opened fire. The Zero, caught completely by surprise, erupted into a ball of flame. It worked. The Thak Weave wasn't a silver bullet, but it was a fighting chance. It was proof that teamwork and tactics could begin to counter superior individual performance. Tactics were one thing, a shield against annihilation. But to design and build a true Zero killer, American engineers needed to get their hands on one. And then on June 4th, 1942, the very same day Thak was proving his weave over the Pacific, a bizarre and fateful event unfolded hundreds of miles to the north in the cold, foggy Aleutian Islands. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, a 19-year-old pilot from the carrier Ryujo, was flying his Zero on a raid against Dutch Harbor when his plane was struck by ground fire. The bullets severed a critical oil line, and a thin stream of black fluid began to trail from his engine. Koga knew instantly he couldn't make it back to his carrier. His orders were clear. In case of an emergency, he was to attempt a landing on the nearby Akutan Island, where a Japanese submarine was waiting on standby to rescue downed pilots. Circling over Akutan, Koga and his 2 wingmen spotted what appeared to be a perfect flat grassy field, an ideal spot for an emergency landing. He lowered his landing gear and glided down, his wingmen watching as the pristine fighter settled gently toward the earth. But the field was a deadly trap. It wasn't solid ground. It was a soft, boggy muskeg, a type of wetland common in the frigid north. The moment the Zero's wheels touched down, they dug violently into the soft earth. The aircraft flipped onto its back with tremendous force, killing Koga instantly, likely from a broken neck. His wingmen, under strict orders not to let any Zero fall into enemy hands, circled overhead. But they saw no fire, and tragically believing Koga might still be alive, they couldn't bring themselves to shoot up the wreck. They made a fateful decision, turned their planes for home, and left the nearly intact Zero behind, hidden in the Alaskan fog. For over a month, the priceless prize lay there, swallowed by the Aleutian mist. Then, on July 10th, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane, piloted by Lieutenant William Bill Thies, became lost while on patrol and happened to fly directly over the island. Thies spotted the unmistakable red meatball insignias on the wings of the overturned fighter. A recovery team was immediately dispatched. What they found was a treasure almost beyond value. The Akutan Zero was painstakingly salvaged. Teams struggled with heavy equipment, but after a few failed attempts, they managed to free the plane from the bog and haul it to a barge. It was shipped to the Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego. There, engineers meticulously repaired the minor damage, painted it with American markings, and on September the 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders took it to the skies for its first test flight. Those test flights were a profound revelation. Over the course of 24 flights, America's top pilots systematically flew the captured Zero against their own frontline fighters. The P-38 Lightning, the P-51 Mustang, and of course, the F-4F Wildcat. For the first time, the Zero's mystique was stripped away, its performance was quantified, and its weaknesses were laid bare for all to see. The test reports read like a blueprint for the Zero's destruction. Yes, it was confirmed to be incredibly nimble at low speeds, but above 200 knots, about 230 miles per hour, the controls became incredibly heavy, making it slow and difficult to roll. An American fighter, by contrast, could roll with comparative ease at high speeds. The Zero's engine also featured a float-type carburetor, which meant that in a sudden dive, a negative G maneuver, the engine would sputter and cut out from fuel starvation. Most importantly, the tests confirmed its greatest, most fundamental flaw. It was a glass cannon. It simply couldn't take a punch, and it couldn't dive with the heavier American planes. A Wildcat or Corsair, if threatened, could simply push its nose down into a steep dive and walk away from a pursuing Zero, which risked tearing its own wings off if it tried to follow. The capture of the Akutan Zero was a monumental turning point in the Pacific Air War. One Japanese historian later claimed its loss was no less serious than the entire strategic defeat at the Battle of Midway. The intelligence it provided was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. The THAC weave had given pilots a way to survive. The Akutan Zero gave American engineers the precise data they needed to dominate. Tactics were a shield. Intelligence was a spear. But to truly win the air war and drive the Japanese empire back, America needed an anvil. It needed a fighter aircraft built not just to survive an encounter with a Zero, but to actively hunt it down and smash it from the sky. That fighter was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The company behind it was Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, affectionately nicknamed the Iron Works. This nickname stemmed from their design philosophy, which was the polar opposite of the one that created the Zero. Where Japanese engineers like Horikoshi chased lightweight agility at the cost of all else, Grumman, led by the pragmatic Leroy Grumman, built planes to take an extraordinary amount of punishment and, above all, bring their pilots home. Their existing F-F Wildcat was a testament to this philosophy, tough and rugged, but it was badly outmatched in performance. Grumman knew it, and so did the Navy. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Grumman was already working on a successor to the Wildcat, but after the Zero's stunning debut, and with a flood of grim combat reports and priceless intelligence from the captured Akutan Zero, the project took on a new, urgent, and highly specific focus: beat the Zero by systematically refusing to play its game. The lessons learned from the Akutan Zero became the Hellcat's design gospel. Every known weakness of the Zero was to be countered with overwhelming, brute force strength. It all started with the engine. The Hellcat was designed around a true monster, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine was a marvel of engineering, churning out over 2,000 horsepower, more than double the power of the Zero's engine. This immense power gave the Hellcat exactly what American pilots craved: speed, especially in a climb, and, most critically, in a dive. A Hellcat pilot could now dictate the terms of the fight. Pilots were explicitly trained to avoid the slow-speed turning dogfights where the Zero excelled, and instead employ a strategy known as boom and zoom, or energy fighting. The tactic was simple and deadly: climb high above the enemy, dive down for a single, devastating high-speed attack, and then use that speed and power to climb back up to a position of safety, ready to strike again. Next, and equally important, was survivability. The Hellcat was the Ironworks philosophy made real. It was, in essence, an aluminum tank. The pilot sat in a cockpit cage, protected by over 200 pounds of armor plating and a thick, bulletproof windscreen. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. A bullet that would turn a fragile Zero into an instant fireball would often just leave a small, weeping hole in a Hellcat's tank, as the rubber lining swelled to seal the puncture. It was not uncommon for Hellcats to return to their carriers riddled with over 100 bullet and cannon holes, a testament to a plane that simply refused to die. Finally, there was the matter of firepower. While the Zero mixed cannons and smaller machine guns, the Hellcat carried a uniform battery of 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing. These guns could unleash a torrent of heavy, powerful rounds capable of shredding a lightly built Zero in a matter of seconds. A short, well-aimed burst was all it took to disintegrate the enemy fighter. The result wasn't a nimble, graceful dogfighter like the Zero. The Hellcat was a brute. It was a heavy, powerful, and incredibly durable war machine built for a single, lethal purpose. And it was the perfect aircraft for the thousands of new pilots America was churning out. These pilots might not have had the thousands of flight hours of the pre-war Japanese aces, but they were well-trained in gunnery and energy tactics, and the Hellcat was forgiving and perfectly suited to their strengths. Meanwhile, Grumman's factories on Long Island became an industrial marvel, eventually streamlining production to the point where one new Hellcat was rolling off the assembly line every single hour, around the clock. In just 2 years of production, over 12,000 Hellcats were built. When the Hellcats began reaching the fleet in force in 1943, the change in morale was immediate and profound. The deep-seated fear that had plagued the ready rooms for nearly 2 years began to fade, replaced by an aggressive, predatory spirit. American pilots now had the tactics from THAC. They had the intelligence from the Akutan Zero. They had standardized training, and now they had the ultimate tool for the job. The stage was set for a massive showdown that would pit this new American air power against the last, best effort of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By June of 1944, the tide of the war in the Pacific had irrevocably turned. American forces were island-hopping relentlessly across the ocean, getting ever closer to Japan. The next major objective was the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. For the Japanese High Command, this was the absolute line in the sand. The loss of the Marianas was unthinkable, as it would put their home islands, including Tokyo, directly within range of America's new fleet of B-29 Superfortress bombers. The commander of the Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, devised a daring and complex plan named AGO. He knew his pilots were no longer the seasoned elite aces of 1942. Most were now hastily trained rookies, but his carrier aircraft possessed a slightly longer range than their American counterparts, and he planned to use this advantage. He would launch his planes from a safe distance, strike the American carriers, supporting the invasion of Saipan, fly onto land, and refuel at bases on Guam and Rota, and then hit the American fleet again on their way back. It was Japan's last, best hope to score a decisive victory and halt the American advance. Facing him was the U.S. Fifth Fleet. At its heart was the formidable Task Force 58, commanded by the legendary Vice Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher. It was, without question, the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen, centered on a core of 15 aircraft carriers that carried over 900 planes, the vast majority of which were brand-new F-6F Hellcats. On the morning of June 19, 1944, the radar screens in the combat information centers of the American carriers lit up with contacts. Ozawa's first wave was on its way. The call went out across the U.S. carriers. Launch the fighters! Launch the fighters! Within minutes, the sky was filled with hundreds of blue-gray Hellcats climbing to meet the inbound enemy. What followed was not a battle. It was a systematic, one-sided slaughter. Guided by expert fighter directors on the ships below, who vectored them into perfect ambush positions, the Hellcats descended upon the Japanese formations like a plague. The inexperienced Japanese pilots, flying in rigid, predictable formations, flew straight into a buzzsaw of American firepower. A pilot on the USS Lexington famously exulted over the radio, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot back home." The name stuck instantly. The engagement would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Hellcats were unleashed. They tore into the Japanese planes, Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo planes, swatting them from the sky with ruthless efficiency. One after another, they trailed smoke and fire, spiraling down into the vastness of the Philippine Sea. Of the 69 planes that made up Ozawa's first wave, a staggering 42 were shot down before they ever laid eyes on an American ship. A second, much larger wave of 128 Japanese planes followed. It met precisely the same fate. Hellcats that had landed, rearmed, and refueled in a matter of minutes were already back in the air, climbing to intercept. This time, nearly 100 Japanese planes were destroyed. The radio channels were a chaotic riot of triumphant shouts as American pilots excitedly called out their kills. One pilot, Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu, became a living legend that day. Already an established ace, he dove his Hellcat single-handedly into a formation of Japanese bombers. In a breathtaking display of gunnery, he shot down 6 of them in just 8 minutes, using only 360 rounds of ammunition. The photograph of Vrachu, back safely on his carrier, grinning in his cockpit and holding up 6 fingers, became the iconic image of the astoundingly lopsided victory. By the end of the day, the results were staggering and decisive. The Japanese had lost over 300 carrier aircraft and the vast majority of their remaining experienced pilots. American losses in the air for the day? Just 29 planes. The following day, Admiral Mitchell launched a counterattack at extreme range, the famed Mission Beyond Darkness, which saw American planes sink a Japanese carrier and damage several other ships, though many of the returning U.S. aircraft ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the death knell for Japanese naval aviation. It wasn't just the catastrophic loss of planes, it was the irreplaceable loss of the pilots who flew them. Ozawa's carriers were now hollowed out, empty shells. The battle was the ultimate, bloody vindication of the Hellcat's superiority. The wall of steel had held, and in doing so, it had shattered Japan's sword. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than just a victory, it was an annihilation. It was the moment the Zero's reign of terror officially and brutally ended, and the age of the Hellcat was cemented in blood and fire. The sky over the Pacific now belonged unequivocally to the United States Navy. The Hellcat's legacy is written in its staggering combat record. In just 2 years of service, Hellcat pilots claimed over 5,100 enemy aircraft shot down. This accounted for as much as 75% of all aerial victories achieved by the U.S. Navy in the entire Pacific theater. But the most telling, and perhaps most poetic, statistic of all is its final kill ratio. For every one F-6F Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, 19 enemy aircraft were destroyed. A 19-to-1 ratio. The terror and shame of the Zero's early 12-to-1 success had been utterly and devastatingly reversed. How was such a dramatic and complete turnaround possible in such a short period of time? It was a perfect storm of American ingenuity, adaptation, and overwhelming industrial power. It began with intelligence. The incredible luck of capturing the Akutan Zero stripped away the mystery and myth surrounding the enemy's best fighter. It provided the U.S. with a precise technical playbook for its destruction, revealing critical flaws that could be ruthlessly exploited. It grew with sea tactics. Battlefield innovations like the THAC Weave gave outmatched pilots a way to use teamwork to survive and fight back. This evolved into the disciplined boom and zoom energy fighting doctrine that became standard for Hellcat pilots, a strategy that completely nullified the Zero's one great advantage, its low-speed maneuverability. It was realized through warm technology. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was a machine purpose-built to kill Zeros. Grumman's Ironworks philosophy of prioritizing power, armor, and firepower created a veritable sledgehammer designed specifically to break a finely crafted scalpel. And finally, it was sustained by sheer industrial might. While Japan struggled mightily to replace its handful of elite, irreplaceable pilots and its carefully crafted planes, America's factories and training programs were running at full throttle. They produced thousands of well-trained pilots and over 12,000 Hellcats. By 1944, a new American pilot entering combat was often more experienced and better trained than his Japanese opponent, a complete and total reversal from the state of affairs at the start of the war. Even in the final, desperate days of the war, when Japan unleashed the kamikaze, it was the Hellcats that formed the Big Blue Blanket, a protective shield of fighters that relentlessly patrolled the fleet, intercepting suicide attackers and absorbing horrific losses to protect the ships below. The story of the Zero and the Hellcat is more than just a tale of two remarkable machines. It's the story of how a nation, caught completely off guard and reeling from a devastating attack, responded not with panic, but with cold, calculated resolve. It's about how the terror of the lone aerial predator was met with intelligence, how the art of the individual duel was countered by the strength of the team, and how lightweight finesse was ultimately and brutally crushed by heavyweight industrial power. It is the story of how a legendary fighter's 12-to-1 kill ratio was finally and irrevocably broken against a wall of steel.